Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and we've got a 3-for-1 tonight because not only do you have to put up with me, but we get Kevin Pawlak and Jon-Erik Gilot. This is just a double team of awesomeness. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So we're going to talk a little bit about your new book, John Brown and the Raid on Harper's Ferry. And let me just throw this right out to start with. Is he a freedom fighter or a domestic terrorist? Go.
Go.
Oh,
I've made a conscious decision not to try to change any hearts or minds because, a lot of people have appropriated John Brown for whatever cause they like. So, if we can just try to place Brown within his time, then I'm happy enough. But I don't want to come down on any one side of the argument because I would have upset Rob Orison, first of all, probably no matter which side I came down on. But no, I tried really hard not to insert myself and my own feelings about Brown, whatever they may be, into our story here.
All right, Kevin?
I would tend to agree with Jon-Erik there. I hate to take, option C out of all this, but I think what's interesting too is a lot of what's happened recently, especially in, really American and world history within the last 20 years, where the word terrorism and terrorist has been used so much as a, form of warfare now that we've seen grow into the 21st century. It wasn't something that was really thought about much in the 19th century at all. And so I think some of what we're doing with Brown is sort of viewing him through a 21st century prism as compared to how he would have been viewed by people back in the 19th century as well. And I think Brown's style of warfare, I guess, if you want to call it that, was very unique and probably hasn't been seen by many people, no matter which century we're talking about, in the sense that, yes, there was violence involved. Certainly, there's no doubt about that. But also, if you look at how Brown had treated some of the people that he would have considered to have been his enemies, slaveholders during Brown's raid and whatnot, it's very different from what we might think of as somebody who's described as a terrorist.
I love that answer. Go ahead, Jon-Erik.
No, I was going to say that's something that we try to do today. We try to make these 19th century figures fit our 21st century ideas of right and wrong. And, especially with the terrorist connotation, we mostly think about that as like religious fanatics, right? When you think of Osama bin Laden, these kind of crazy religious people. And Brown was a very religious person. The Bible guided his every thought and his every action. His parents were Calvinists. Brown was a Calvinist. He was raised believing in this divine predestination. So when Brown said, that he was God's instrument to root out and destroy slavery, he really believed that. And today, when we think of these kind of fanatical kind of people, we mostly associate that with, terrorism. So I think that's trying to make people fit our ideas today is where that comes along. But Brown hasn't been done any favors, like in the, if you think back to the 1950s and Santa Fe Trail, you think of Raymond Massey and it's kind of wild depiction of Brown. That's one generation. And then the next generation might be what year did Ken Burns' Civil War come out?
Late 80s, early 90s?
Late 80s, early 90s. That was my first introduction to him, where you have Ed Bars and David McCullough saying John Brown was a failure and 6 states and failed in everything he did. And then today, people's, the new generation's opinion of John Brown might be Ethan Hawke and Good Lord Bird, which I loved. There's terrible history, but I loved it. So he hasn't been done any favors.
It's and I intentionally posed the question as an inflammatory sort of either or, just to grab people's attention, which is why I'm delighted with your answers, because refusing to be pigeonholed into the either or, and like, hey, we've got to look at some of these subtleties and complexities and framings and modern context versus historical versus memory and all that stuff. So who is John Brown? Because we've got a lot of layers to this onion. As you guys peeled those layers away to write this book, who did you find in the middle?
Yeah, so writing the book, if I can jump in here, Kevin, we kind of took I took the first half of Brown's life, or most of the first part of his life there, from birth up to the time of the raid, up to stepping away from the Kennedy farmhouse, and then Kevin took him from the Kennedy farmhouse through the raid and trial and the execution and fallout and memory. And so we kind of tried to blend our two voices together with that. But like I said, Brown was born in 1800 in Connecticut, May 1800 in Connecticut. Like I said, devout Calvinist. His father, Owen Brown, was a devout abolitionist. He removed the family over to Ohio in 1805. But there he helped to found the Western Reserve Anti-Slavery Society. He founded a church that was kind of based on anti-slavery activism. But really from a young age, he had learned to despise slavery. At a young age, he witnessed a slave about his own age that he felt was poorly clothed and lodged in cold weather. And he saw that slave being beaten with irons and shovels and anything that came to hand. And he said that was the thing that really turned him into a devout abolitionist, a determined abolitionist, he said. And it was that singular event that he kept coming back to later in his life that really made him, as he said, swear an eternal war against slavery.
Kevin, who did you discover as you peeled back the layers of the onion?
Well, geez, I had to cover about 6 weeks of Brown's life as compared to, John covering over 50, nearly 60 years of his life. But I've been with Brown a long time, and I've always joked, having worked previously at Harper's Ferry, that you can never escape John Brown now, that he's everywhere. And he truly was everywhere. He was somebody that traveled all across what was known as the United States and even beyond, into Kansas territory, of course, before that. But Brown was somebody, I think, who was very much a man of purpose. And he knew, as Jon-Erik just mentioned, from his earliest days, what his purpose was and what he believed it to be, and was somebody who put everything he possibly could to a cause that he found to be just and righteous. And that, of course, was the extermination of slavery. And I think Frederick Douglass perhaps said it best about Brown, and I think about Brown's character, when Douglass had said that he could live for the slave, but John Brown could die for the slave. And that was, to me, that really sums up Brown's ideas and Brown's, I hesitate to use the word extremism, but I think he was extreme at that time for, again, as Douglass said, being willing to go the extra mile for achieving what he believed to be his goal of ending slavery. That Brown was willing to do a lot of things that a lot of people weren't willing to do at that time to abolish slavery.
Now,
I think I found. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I think I found a more complex character than like I said, what we've been fed through the Raymond Masseys and Ethan Hawke's, and like I said, my first introduction to Brown in the Ken Burns series was Ed Barrs saying, John Brown was a failure and everything in life, and it's a really simplistic view of Brown. Everyone wants to chalk up his failures, but we don't talk about like the financial panics in like 1819 and 1837, where a lot of people struggled financially. Your boy toy Ulysses Grant, I mean, he declared bankruptcy a couple times, I think, and Matthew Brady and Mark Twain and Abraham Lincoln, all these people struggled financially. But it's become like the sexy popular opinion that Brown was this great failure, when he actually gained, some kind of acclaim. He had many business ventures, but he wasn't such a failure at. He was a purveyor in wool and sheep, and gained some real renown with that. And so he wasn't a failure in everything in life. And I don't want people to think that I'm defending Brown with everything. That's certainly not the case. But he was a complex guy, and I feel like we've been fed a very simplistic, sterile depiction of him.
So how is it a guy who is involved in a massacre in Kansas walking around free to be able to even, lead into to this attempted raid?
Well, he grew that long beard. Brown had 20 children between two wives. I've got two children with one wife, and I'm on my way to this gray beard that he had there. No, he definitely spent the rest of his life literally with a bounty on his head.
So it wasn't like he goes out and does that in Kansas and come back and everyone's like, oh yeah, that stuff. I mean, he's kind of living under a shadow after that.
No, he assumed some different identities. Isaac Smith famously, when he arrived at Harper's Ferry, Shubal Morgan, when he was in Kansas, he grew out the beard to help conceal himself. I'm sorry, Kevin, you want to say something there?
And I think he obviously, and I'm sure we'll get into this more with the Secret Six and whatnot, but he had friends in high places that certainly helped. And also, I think as a precursor to what you'll see once Brown becomes a figurehead for the abolitionist movement, is that most of that time Brown is traveling throughout the North and even into Canada, where I wouldn't say the majority of the population is sympathetic towards him, certainly, but I think they're not as willing to go and cash in on the price on Brown's head as Southerners are, or border ruffians out in the Kansas territory as well. So Brown does travel back to Kansas a couple of times after the Potawatomi massacre and whatnot. But again, he does keep his head low, but he also has a lot of people to protect him, so to speak. Not saying he's walking around with bodyguards or anything like that, but again, he has friends in high places with deep pockets, and that helps out a lot, I think.
So just
he really.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just keep interrupting you.
I was going right ahead.
No, he really went back and forth between East and West for several years, raising money, recruiting his men. I think President Buchanan had offered like a $250 bounty on his head, and Brown quipped that he'd give $2.50 for Buchanan's head. So he was playing into it at the same time.
So for listeners who don't know, tell us a little bit about what the Potawatomi Creek massacre was. And I keep wanting to say Totopotomy Creek. You can tell my head's in the 1864 Overland Campaign. What was the Potawatomi Creek massacre?
Yeah, so Potawatomi Creek, by this time we are out in Kansas. In 1854, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where it essentially leaves the Kansas and Nebraska territories open for popular sovereignty, where the settlers or the property owners in those territories could decide whether they would be admitted to the Union as free or slave states. And slaveholders had essentially ceded Nebraska, said, all right, you can have that. But with Kansas, we're going to draw our line in the sand. So you have, free soil, abolitionists coming in from New England and the northern states, and you have pro-slavery border ruffians coming in from Missouri, trying to settle these territories, get their votes in, to get these state legislatures seated, and to get the states admitted in each of their favors. So Brown's family actually went out there in 1855, or several members of his family went out there, and they felt like as soon as they arrived, as soon as they crossed over into Missouri, that they were marked for destruction. So they sent their father a letter back in New York. Brown was back with his family in North Elba, Timbuktu, which was an African-American colony there that they were helping to launch. And they wrote to him that, we need guns more than we need bread. We need your help out here. So Brown went out into Kansas. He had commanded a militia company several times in the Wakarusa War in late 1855. Just missed out on the sacking of Lawrence in May of 1856. He was on his way there when Lawrence was sacked, looted, and he was incensed that this could happen. And so it was May 24th when Brown directed the murder of 5 pro-slavery men along Pottawatomie Creek. He had his sons and a few other men there with him. Brown did not actually wield one of the famous broadswords in this attack. Never admitted to having any involvement. I would hate to, I don't even like the connotation there, but comparing him to Charles Manson, where I don't think Manson murdered anyone, but he directed like his followers to commit those murders, and that was kind of Brown's role. So we like to, I think popular media has made these men out as to be unoffending, that they were innocent people. These were very pro-slavery men who were out there. But I don't want to make it sound like I'm a Brown apologist. But definitely a very brutal act out along the Pottawatomie Creek. And like I said, Brown really spent the rest of his life with a bounty on his head after this.
Now, earlier you talked about, our tendency these days to impose our modern interpretation on historical events. And here we've got an instance where we've got political disagreement that is so intense that people resort to violence. And it's hard not to kind of see current events in some of those lights at times, which I think is a great reason to study history. It's like, okay, well, what happened? What lessons can we learn from that? And how can maybe that guide us today, without necessarily imposing a particular interpretation on what that might be. So he comes back to the East. Kevin, you referred earlier to the Secret Six, the friends in high places. Tell me a little bit about who these friends are and how they help Brown as he sort of shifts into his next phase.
So the Secret Six was a name given to him later on, but it was a group of 6 men, various backgrounds, all, of course, anti-slavery, wealthy men living throughout New England, New York State, that Brown had curried to get support for, mainly financial support from these men to pay for things like pikes, the famous John Brown pikes that he would contract out for 1,000 of those from a blacksmith in Connecticut. And these men sort of really were men that, again, had anti-slavery views, but weren't willing to go so far as Brown was willing to go in order to extinguish slavery, or at least damage slavery in the southern states. So that's hence the name of the Secret Six, why they remained behind the curtains while willing to financially back Brown. And it got to a point with these men where essentially one of them, I can't remember, Jon-Erik, you might remember if it was Higginson or Stearns, basically just gave Brown not a blank check, but gave him quite a bit of money and just said, basically, I don't want to know what you're doing with it, but just go ahead and take it and use it.
Brown got perturbed at one point. He said, like, money comes easy enough. I can find the money, which was not the case because he never had enough money.
Yeah.
But he felt like, people are willing to give me money, but they don't want to be seen with me or associated with me. They just want to throw money at me, where he really needed the men. That's what it came down to, at Harper's Ferry with these, 21 men in this army. He felt like it was much easier to get the money than it was the men.
I understand that Harriet Tubman was also involved at different points with Brown's plans. Tell me a little bit about that.
So yeah, he had. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, he had courted a lot of the, what we would consider the abolitionist luminaries, like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, and he had tried to recruit Harriet Tubman to come up to Canada to the Chatham Convention. That was in May 1858, and he really thought that having that the people of these stature associated with him would help his cause, and ultimately he called on a lot of people to join him up in Canada, and not many of them really panned out, and Harriet Tubman did not show up there, but Brown was super impressed with her, and he was trying to call on friends in high places where he had them financially. He was trying to call on them also in the anti-slavery abolitionist field as well, and it didn't pan out as well for him. And he called on Frederick Douglass again in August of 1859, just a few months before the raid. And Douglass said, thanks, but no thanks. You're going into a perfect steel trap. as he described it several decades later.
And it turned out to be so. So Brown still thinks this is going to be a good idea, or is he kind of fatalistic about it as he gets ready to march on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry?
I would have to think that Brown certainly had built in a plan B, if you will, that, you know, maybe this thing was going to go haywire, and that if Brown's plan ended up not working, these lightning raids coming out of the Allegheny Mountains to go in and basically financially undermine the institution of slavery. That's what Brown was trying to do with this raid, while of course gathering weapons to the tune of, there were about 100,000 firearms stored at Harper's Ferry when Brown struck in October of 1859. But I think Brown went in with the idea thinking that his plan would actually work. But also I do think that there was again, almost a plan B that Brown had envisioned, that, hey, if this doesn't work and I'm captured alive, that I can be more valuable as a martyr and being executed, being publicly hanged. And the thing that Brown, in my opinion, I think, you know, if Brown had been killed at Harper's Ferry in October of 1859, there'd still probably be books out about him, certainly. But where Brown really makes a name for himself is the last 6 weeks of his life, when he's in jail and in the courtroom in the seat of Jefferson County in Charlestown, Virginia at the time, today West Virginia. And that's where Brown, I think, really starts to understand what he can be to the anti-slavery movement and to the abolitionist movement. And this was something Brown recognized early on. He's interviewed by a newspaper correspondent shortly following the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre in Kansas. And Brown then travels throughout the North, and I think sees the power of the press, frankly, and how he could rally people to his cause, or not rally people to his cause, but at least use the press to get his own views out there. And that's ultimately, I don't want to get too far ahead of the story, but Brown's speech that he gives on November 2nd, 1859, when he is told that he is going to be hanged a month from now, December 2nd, is later compared by some to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And, you know, that's something that Brown uses well. He uses the written and spoken word more so than a Sharp's carbine that he goes into Harper's Ferry with, to win people to his side. And I think he probably had that in the back of his mind, that could be a good plan as well, in case things did not succeed and did not go the way he wanted them to go in Harper's Ferry.
All right, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, more from Kevin and Jon-Erik on the Emerging Civil War podcast. And we're back in the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Makowski. Joining me today, Kevin Pawlak and Jon-Erik Gilot, my colleagues who have written a new book for the Emerging Civil War series called John Brown and the Raid on Harper's Ferry. And Jon-Erik, I know that you kind of about to chime in there on something Kevin was just talking about before the break, where Kevin talks about this, you know, idea that John Brown becomes something in his last 6 weeks, and maybe he could have been more, but if he'd been actually killed during the raid, he wouldn't have been able to achieve kind of his quote unquote full potential. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, both Kevin and I, we have essays coming out in the forthcoming, right, Chris?
Forthcoming,
volume 2 of the Great What Ifs of the American Civil War from the Emerging Civil War series. But, you know, in that book, Kevin and I make kind of a counterpoint where I look at, you know, what if Brown had escaped from Harper's Ferry? What might his plans have been? What might have happened? And as Kevin alluded to there, you know, Kevin looked at, you know, what would have happened had Brown been killed at Harper's Ferry? What might have changed there, where he becomes an immediate martyr rather than having, you know, the next several weeks of his life, the next 6 weeks or so, where he has that bully pulpit a little bit. And so, you know, I look at, as Kevin had alluded to, kind of that economic warfare where Brown had hoped for these lightning strikes where he could fall on these farms or plantations in the night and steal away with their slaves and fall back into the mountains, kind of shuttling them up through the Cumberland Valley and north into freedom. But he, you know, Brown was very familiar with the Harper's Ferry area. He had surveyed there around 1840, I think it was, and he admitted later in life that, you know, most of the time he wasn't surveying. He was looking at this area as a means of shuttling slaves north to freedom. He saw these natural corridors and these forts in the mountains where he thought that a smaller number of his men and escaped slaves could fight and defend themselves against anyone that came after them. And he felt like his time in Kansas had proved that this could work, where he was, fighting against a greater number of people with a smaller number of men. In late 1858, where he took his raid into Missouri and liberated 11 slaves. He saw those slaves armed and fighting for their freedom at the Battle of the Spurs, which happened near Holton, Kansas. So this idea that he had of smaller number of men fighting from fortified positions and escaped slaves fighting for their freedom, he saw all that happen in Kansas, and he felt like it could work in Harper's Ferry. But he felt like this version of economic warfare along the Upper South, where he could destabilize the slave economy, essentially. He felt that if he could drive slavery out of one county in Maryland, in Virginia, that he could weaken it throughout the entire state and thereby weaken it throughout the South. So he did have plans. His plan certainly wasn't to be captured at Harper's Ferry. Now, that did not work into his plans. But it was interesting for this forthcoming book, looking at what might have happened had he made it out, and how might have things played out differently had he been killed there.
Terry Bisson has a really interesting book written in 1988 called Fire on the Mountain, where Brown actually does get up into the mountains with some of his supporters and holds out and succeeds, and kind of interesting speculative fiction as a result of that. Kevin, you talked about a few minutes ago that Brown sort of comes into his own when he's in the courtroom, when he's in jail, that last 6 weeks of his life. And you've both sort of talked about your first exposure to Brown, and mine was in that old TV miniseries, The Blue and the Gray. And I remember John Brown in the courtroom and his deep resonant voice and the crimes of this country purged by blood, and how stirring that was. And so I can kind of see, when you say that that's his becoming moment. It certainly was for me watching it on TV. What does he become? What do those 6 weeks do for him?
I think Brown becomes a martyr. He goes from a lot of people. Certainly, of course, he doesn't have many friends in the South at all by what he's done in Harper's Ferry. But in his weeks later, in the last 6 weeks of his life, he gains at least some respect in the South, not respect for what he was doing, but just respect for, John Wilkes Booth, who witnesses Brown's execution, talks about seeing Brown and how stoically he's taking all of this, that Brown is not afraid to stand up and to die for what he believes in. And Southerners, I think, respected that. Many did. Again, not to say that they liked Brown at all, but they at least came to respect his convictions, and that he was a man of convictions. Throughout the North, I think in the last 6 weeks of his life, he would become truly a martyr and a symbol for the anti-slavery movement. Again, not all abolitionists or anti-slavery men were in favor of the means by which Brown tried to abolish slavery throughout the United States. But after Brown's speech, especially on November 2nd, 1859, where he calls on God and calls on the Bible and says, basically evokes the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, things like that. Brown, it gets to the point where throughout the North, shops are closed on December 2nd, 1859, at the hour when Brown is going to dangle at the end of a rope. Church bells toll throughout the North, marking the hour of Brown's last breath as his body is being taken back to North Elba by his wife. There are people coming out to see him, or to see the casket being moved from one train to the next, or being moved closer and closer to Brown's final resting place at North Elba. And then by chance, what that then does is the South sort of leaps onto this and starts trying to attach Brown to these radical abolitionists, to the Republican Party as well. They try attaching Brown, especially to William Seward, who at this point is the leading candidate, it seems, for the Republican nomination coming up in the election of 1860. And it's ultimately going to be a speech that Lincoln gives in New York City at the Cooper Union that's going to almost catapult Lincoln into the lead for the Republican nomination in 1860 when he disassociates the Republican Party from Brown and his actions. And so what you see is sort of a ping pong game going back and forth with the North has Brown in their hands, and the South is trying to use that against them, and they'll volley back and fire back at the South, and the South will fire back as well. Edmund Ruffin, of course, is also going to play into this. He's going to take some of the pikes that are captured that Brown has had made to arm slaves with, and he's going to send one to each Southern governor saying that this is what awaits you from your Northern brethren, things like that. So Brown is really going to be used by both sides because of not only his raid, but the trial that takes place and his execution as well to fuel the flames of their cause, of their respective cause, whatever that might be.
Yeah, Brown really, he started to understand the power of the press from his time in Kansas, where he was granting interviews, and but both, for and against him, he was seeing how it kind of helped to shape his notoriety, and absolutely, he was using that bully pulpit, from the courthouse in Charlestown, and there's a lot of great material to draw on from this time period, whether it's editorials in newspapers or, it really reduced the margins of neutrality at this time. Everyone kind of, after John Brown, you had to kind of take a side at that point. Here was a white man who was going to his death over slavery. And so that those dinner table conversations, it really reduced that margin of neutrality.
Having read a lot of the newspaper coverage of the trial and the editorials around his arrest and his imprisonment, obviously some strong feelings, and even more than 160 years later, we know that this was a really polarizing event. But to actually read the prose in those papers, I mean, some of it is just venomous in ways that are shocking even to me as a journalism professor who's read a lot of partisan newspapers. People had really strong feelings of this. Does that in some ways calcify public opinion in a way that does lead to the war? Is this really a direct connection, or is it just sort of one more step in the escalation?
Yeah, Kevin, what was the great quote that you found? It was someone in South Carolina, maybe, where the guy said that he wanted to do nothing more than to kill a John Brown or something like that.
Yeah. Yes, it was a North Carolinian that said he would travel 100 miles to go and kill a John Brown man. Things like that. There's a New York newspaper, I can't remember which one, I think it's the Herald, that says Brown's raid and Brown's death has done more than any other event in our history to push the country towards disunion. I've always hesitated to say, that Brown's raid is the final straw, because ultimately, there's still going to be, I got to do math real quick in my head, which I'm not good at as a historian, but about a year and a half roughly until the first true shots of the war are fired in Charleston, South Carolina. Though some people would argue the first shots were fired in Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. There's still a lot that can go on, but Brown's raid, I think, like Jon-Erik said, really starts to set the battle lines, if you will. Governor Henry Wise of Virginia, immediately after this, is sending up the best rifles that Virginia has in its state armories and arsenals to the northern border of the state to prevent what they call another invasion. So this is very much a gearing up for war by the South. And that is shown in no better place than the abundance of militia that's there around Brown at the gallows. 1,500 Virginia militia are there. The town is basically under martial law at that point. There are cannons pointed directly at Brown's cell to make sure that he doesn't escape or that people don't try to get him out. So this is where the militarization of the South really starts to become serious, once they see that no longer are these words and fights that are breaking out on the floors of the Senate, but now somebody, like Jon-Erik said, specifically a white man, is willing to bring the war to the South over the issue of slavery.
Since you mentioned the militia, I, of course, have to mention Stonewall Jackson leading the Corps of Cadets from VMI to help oversee the execution, since being a Jackson fanboy, got to work him in there. Right? So.
And it was really interesting during the course of my research here. I ordered some of the militia pay records from the Virginia Historical Society, or wherever in Richmond that has these records. But I found that I had an ancestor who was present at the execution as a member of one of the Virginia militia companies that I had no idea about this person, about his involvement in the militia, but I found his name there on the payroll. These militia were paid by the state for their service in Charlestown, and I found his name there and started researching back and found that I was related to this guy. I couldn't believe it. He later went on. A year later, he moved out to Iowa, and he was captain of an infantry company from Iowa during the Civil War. But it was a fascinating connection to the story that I had no idea. And that this particular company were placed directly in front of the gallows. They had a front row seat to Brown's execution. So interesting personal connection that I found.
And I want to ask you about that because you have several personal connections to this story and to Harper's Ferry and to this book that I think make it particularly cool for me as an editor to know that this personal connection exists. Tell us a little bit about why Harper's Ferry is of particular interest to you and how that led you to this book.
Well, I grew up in a very historic small town in southeastern Ohio where the whole town is a national historic district. You can walk down that main street and it feels very much like you are back in the 1850s or 1860s. It's a very intact historic district. And I went to Harper's Ferry for the first time in 1997. And I felt that same thing. Like Harper's Ferry is like a place where, time has been frozen. You can walk down that street and essentially it looks as it did, at the time Brown was there, at the time of the Civil War. And I thought it was fascinating. Harper's Ferry, most people, you want to retire at the beach or some warm climate or something. I have visions of one day finding myself in Harper's Ferry. Don't tell my wife I said that. But I had a chance to visit there many, many times over the years. Someplace that remains very important to me. But I wanted it to be important to my wife or my future wife. So when I decided I wanted to propose to my wife, I took her to Harper's Ferry, and I had joked with her before that I might ask her to marry me on some battlefield. I don't know if she actually believed me, but I wanted her to feel some kind of connection to that place too. So we hiked up to Maryland Heights. She had to make that hike up the mountain, so she earned it. And I proposed to her there. And so now when I ask her if she wants to go back to Harper's Ferry, she doesn't mind it so much. She doesn't tell me no.
Well
my
played.
girls,
well played.
My girls like it because they associate Harper's Ferry with ice cream. So when we went there, we had ice cream. And so they think it's this place with great ice cream. But so I want them to feel some kind of connection with the place as well. I have the opportunity to travel through that area many times a year for work. So I'm constantly over in that area, and I feel very much at home there, even though I haven't lived there, but hopefully someday will.
So then what led the two of you from that connection to this book?
Well, I feel like it was the only topic that Chris Makowski hadn't tackled in his 327 other books. I felt like this was a safe one. And so
he was going to get to it because of the Jackson connection eventually.
That's right.
So.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We had to get it before he did. So, I think I became involved with ECW as a guest contributor back in 2017, and that continued for a while into 2018 or 2019 whenever I finally came on board. But I think I knew early on that if I was going to do anything for the Emerging Civil War series, it had to at least start with John Brown, a story that I'd been interested in since childhood, since visiting there, since coming home and finding that one of Brown's raiders lived just a few miles down the road from my hometown, Dangerfield, Newby. So I feel like I had so many connections that it was the logical place for me to start. And I had looked up to Kevin. I say that Kevin being younger. I had looked up to Kevin as a historian for several years there, watching the Emerging Civil War Symposium on C-SPAN, and everything that he had accomplished by that point, as an Antietam guide and as a historian for emerging Civil War, that I felt like, if I was going to hitch my wagon to a horse or anything, it would be with Chris Makowski and Kevin Pawlak. And so when I had decided that this might be the place for me to start, I think Kevin had the same idea for a book, and so we got together and decided to co-author or tag team this one.
Kevin,
is that about how it went, Kevin?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I would agree with that. It was a fun ride. It really was, and it was kind of a story coming at a bit differently. I had the privilege of living in Harper's Ferry on a couple of different occasions, and I can remember that's where I really got to cut my teeth as a public historian, as an intern with the National Park Service there. And I can remember many nights living right in Lowertown Harper's Ferry and being able to literally look out of my bedroom window, and I could see the top of the monument marking the original location of John Brown's fort, and could see the cupola of the fort in its current location as well. And just being able to walk around Harper's Ferry at night when there were no visitors and it was just quiet and it was just me in the streets and the history, it was just a really incredible feeling. And I also felt that the Emerging Civil War series was a great way to tell Brown's story, because I think a lot of people know about Brown, certainly, but I don't think a lot of people are willing to pick up, which is perfectly fine, pick up a 500-page book about John Brown and about his raid to really understand that. So, with a lot of Jon-Erik's help, we were able to make this accessible, hopefully, to more people, not just with the book itself, but with the tour guide. 2 tours that we built in at the end, a walking tour of Lowertown Harper's Ferry of sites related to the raid, and then a driving tour as well. So it was really just seemed like a long time coming that I was bound to hitch my horse, if you will, to John Brown at some point.
And I really like how the walking tour actually has on there site where Jon-Erik got engaged, ice cream shop for the girls, right? Or do we take that?
I hope that Kevin, the fun ride part of it was living in Harper's Ferry, because it certainly wasn't writing this book during a pandemic with all of the research facilities closed and with my children, hanging around my ankles as I'm trying to write here, during the lockdown period from March through June or May or whenever that was in 2020. This was it was an interesting experience writing my first book during a global pandemic.
Maybe if I could strike. Sorry, Chris. Maybe if I could strike from the minutes that it was a fun ride and say it was a wild ride instead. How's that?
It was a wild ride.
Yeah. So
but eventually the research facilities reopened. We were able to get a lot of good stuff out of the West Virginia Archives and History in Charleston. But during the pandemic, while things were closed, we were able to make do with a lot of the really good digital material that was out there, from things like the Boyd Stutler collection, and all of the great books and stuff that have been digitized on Google Books and Internet Archives. So it wasn't a wash during that lockdown and that pandemic period. We did get a lot of good stuff done. And I would be really happy if I would try to steal a few minutes here and there to work on the book, like before my daughters woke up or after they went to bed. And I'd feel great about myself if I was sitting down on my computer at 5 a.m. to start writing, and I would open up our shared documents and just find that Kevin had been there since 4 o'clock. His time management is it's incredible. I'm envious.
My time management is only good from about 4 to 6 in the morning, and then after that, it all goes to hell.
Once the rest of the world he goes to bed about 8 o'clock at night, so we're coming up on Kevin's bedtime here.
So coming up on his bedtime here. Yeah, your first book, Jon-Erik. Kevin, you've written several books prior to this, and so you've cut your teeth. But Jon-Erik, first book under trying circumstances. How does it feel now that it's done?
Was so long ago that we worked on it. I almost feel like I'm tired of talking about John Brown at this point. And I could never be tired of talking about John Brown, but I've started to think about other projects at this point. But seeing your name on the cover of a book, I had the opportunity to contribute to several essay books and magazine articles and things like that over the years. But seeing your name on the front cover of a book is something special, and to be able to do it with Kevin, someone I respect so much, that made it a really good experience.
Feeling is mutual. Thank you. It is always exciting seeing your name on a cover.
Yeah. So, dare I ask, what's next?
Go ahead, Kevin.
Ooh, gosh, where to begin?
Yeah, I mean, you've got your hands in like 16 different fires, I know.
Yeah, it seems like it. Yeah. Don't really know exactly what the next big project is that I want. I got a few smaller ones trying to wrap up in the meantime, but definitely turning back to doing some Maryland campaign writing. That's John Brown. The John Brown book was my first book outside of the Maryland campaign. So that was kind of unique to show that I can do more. I'm more than a one-trick pony. But getting back to the Maryland campaign, I think, and doing some research and just continuing to really just get into some research is what I really enjoy. The writing part comes a little hard to me at times, and the research is what gets me out of bed in the morning, early in the morning.
Very early. So,
yes.
You've been doing some fantastic stuff with the Antietam Institute in particular, and the work with the Antietam Guide. So I just want to give you a shout out for what you're doing with them and the way you're helping those guys really just go gangbusters right now. And a lot of really cool publications. So congratulations with your work there.
Thank you. I'm just one small cog in the greater machinery of it all.
Jon-Erik, thoughts about what you might be up to next?
Oh, I'm laboring under so many deadlines, either self-imposed or from people like Chris Makowski. I've started to gather some sources for, I think, what my next book will be. I haven't started writing yet, and we'll leave that for another time. But I've started to pull together some of my resources where maybe later this year, once I clear a little bit off my plate, then I'll think about maybe putting pen to paper and starting book number 2.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, I expect great things from both of you. The book, John Brown and the Raid on Harper's Ferry, just an excellent addition to the literature, great introduction to the story, well written, great pictures, all those sorts of things. Congratulations to both of you on an excellent book.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the help along the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we couldn't have done it without you, Makowski. So thanks for all the help, and thanks for having us here.
Thank you both for being with us. For Kevin Pawlak and Jon-Erik Gilot, I'm Chris Makowski. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.